On the morning of April 9, 1917 at 5:30, an offensive began north of the French city of Arras. An offensive that would go down in history not as a triumph, not as a breakthrough, but as a brutal demonstration of how war devours everyone, attackers and defenders, soldiers and civilians, with equal mercilessness. It was a Monday, snow mixed with rain was falling, and soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force advanced through a blizzard that struck them from behind and lashed the faces of the German defenders. Visibility was terrible. The ground had turned into a muddy, cratered mess, and ahead lay the Scarpe River, an inconspicuous waterway that gave its name to a series of battles that would stretch for months and claim hundreds of thousands of lives. This was not the first blow on this sector of the front, and far from the last, but it was the battles on the Scarpe that exposed something more than just military tactics or strategy. They showed the limits of human endurance, the limits of planning, and the absurdity of the very idea of victory in conditions where every meter of land was bought with blood, and every bridge, every height, every ruined village became not so much a goal as a symbol of futility. In those days, French and British headquarters feverishly studied reports from the front. How to hold a bridge under fire, how to organize a crossing under a hail of shells, how to protect communications when the enemy saw every movement. The German command, in turn, developed new defense methods, not rigid holding of the first line, but flexible withdrawal in depth with subsequent counterattacks from fortified zones. And somewhere on the periphery of this hell, in the towns and villages caught between the hammer of the offensive and the anvil of the defense, civilians, French, Belgians, Poles, and those whom the war found far from home, including Russians, experienced their own tragedy, which no one recorded in military reports. The British went on the attack believing that the new tactics would work. In the long months since the bloody slaughter on the Somme, military leadership had realized that old methods were exhausted. It was no longer possible to throw waves of infantry at machine guns in the hope that quantity would overcome quality. New solutions were needed, more subtle, more flexible. Thus was born the idea of the creeping barrage, an artillery barrage that slowly moved across the battlefield, covering the advancing infantry with a wall of explosions. A week before the attack began, British guns poured more than 2.5 million shells onto German positions, exceeding the entire artillery expenditure on the Somme in the first months. It seemed that nothing alive could survive such a thing. But the Germans survived. They sat in deep dugouts, excavated in chalk formations to a depth of up to 12 meters, where shells could not reach. When the barrage died down, they crawled up and took positions behind machine guns. The only thing that changed after this bombardment was that the trenches ceased to exist as a defense system. They turned into a crater field, where there were no trenches, no barbed wire, no clear front line, but only shell holes filled with water, mud, and bodies. The first hours of the attack brought unexpected success. The blizzard and darkness concealed the British advance, and German sentries did not have time to raise the alarm. Many German soldiers were caught off guard, half-dressed, without boots, knee-deep in the mud of communication trenches. Canadian units on the northern flank stormed Vimy Ridge, dominating the Douai Plain, and by noon on April 10th, they had captured the crest of the ridge, advancing almost 4,000 meters, an unprecedented depth of breakthrough for the Western Front. In the center, the 12th British Division took the village of Fampoux. The 3rd Division captured Tilloy-les-Mouflens. By evening, it seemed that the enemy's defense had collapsed, that the way to the east, to Cambrai and beyond, would soon open. But this breakthrough proved to be an illusion. On the second and third day of the attack, the British encountered something their staffs had not foreseen: a new German tactic of deeply echeloned defense. As early as December 1916, the German Supreme Command had issued a directive, according to which the first line of defense became a sacrificial zone. Advanced posts could retreat under fire, conserving strength for a counterattack. The true defensive line was located on the reverse slopes of the heights, out of sight of enemy observers, and behind it, extending up to 2.5 kilometers deep, was a battle zone, saturated with strong points, machine gun nests, and shelters for reserves. Even further back, in the rear, fresh divisions stood ready to launch a decisive counterstrike. The commander of the German Sixth Army, General Ludwig von Falkenhausen, had not fully absorbed the new doctrine. He ordered the first line to be held at all costs, and this cost the Germans heavy losses on the first day. But on April 11th, his chief of staff was replaced, and Colonel Fritz von Lossberg, one of the creators of the new defensive strategy, arrived to take up the post. Within a few hours, Lossberg restructured the entire defense system. Reserve divisions were moved closer to the front, artillery was redeployed to new positions, and infantry units were given freedom of maneuver, to retreat when threatened with encirclement, but always to counterattack. By mid-April, the British offensive had faltered. Progress slowed to a few hundred meters a day, and losses grew exponentially. Soldiers were exhausted by continuous fighting, artillery had depleted shell supplies, and communication lines were stretched so thin that the delivery of ammunition and evacuation of the wounded became a nightmare. Roads were shattered by shells, bridges across the Scarpe were destroyed or damaged, and every attempt to establish a crossing was met with hurricane fire from German artillery. It was during these days that British and French engineers received an invaluable, albeit bloody, lesson on how to build and defend bridges in modern warfare. Before this, it was believed that it was sufficient to quickly construct a pontoon crossing under the cover of darkness or artillery fire. But the experience of the Scarpe showed any bridge becomes a magnet for enemy fire. German observers from the heights registered every attempt at crossing, and within minutes, artillery covered the target. Pontoons were blown to pieces. Engineering units suffered monstrous losses. The solution was found in the construction of false crossings, demonstrative structures that diverted enemy attention while the real bridge was being built elsewhere. Another tactic was the simultaneous construction of several bridges in a narrow sector to overload enemy artillery with targets. The French command, closely following the course of the battles on the Scarpe, drew its own conclusions. Their main offensive to the south, on the Chemin des Dames, had failed with catastrophic losses, and now the general staff was looking for the reasons for the failure. One of them was recognized as the inability to hold captured crossings over rivers and canals. The Germans had learned not just to destroy bridges during retreat, they mined the approaches to them, set up fortified machine gun positions on the opposite bank, and positioned artillery in such a way as to cover the entire crossing zone. French engineers began to develop new types of rapidly deployable bridges, capable of withstanding not only the weight of infantry, but also artillery, and even the first tanks, which were just beginning to appear on the battlefields. Tanks on the Scarpe proved to be a mixed bag. 40 vehicles of the 1st Brigade were thrown into attack on the 3rd Army front, but most of them got stuck in the mud, broke down, or were hit by German armor-piercing bullets. 4 tanks, sent to storm the village of Bullecourt, south of the Scarpe, veered off course, were discovered by the enemy, and destroyed. Nevertheless, the very fact of these steel monsters appearing on the battlefield made an impression. German infantry was panically afraid of tanks, and even one working tank could break the resistance of an entire section of defense. The lesson was clear. Tanks have a future, but they need to be used en masse, in close coordination with infantry and artillery, and not in scattered groups. On April 23rd, the second phase of the battle on the Scarpe began. After 2 days of frosty weather and poor visibility, at 4:45 in the morning, the British 6th and 7th Corps attacked on a 14-kilometer front. The 51st Highland Division fought fiercely on the western outskirts of Rouen and the chemical plant, while the 37th Division stormed the buildings near Rouen Station. On the left flank, the 63rd Naval Division advanced rapidly and captured the village of Gavrelle. But on the south bank of the Scarpe, the 29th Division barely managed to establish a foothold on the western slopes of Infantry Hill. The Cojeul River, a tributary of the Scarpe, became the boundary between the two divisions of the 6th Corps. The village of Hénin-sur-Cojeul on the north bank could only be taken by the 15th Scottish Division after the 50th Northumberland Division captured the commanding height on the south bank. The Germans counterattacked fiercely, but by the morning of April 24th, the British held Hénin-sur-Cojeul, Gavrelle, and the heights from which Fontaine-les-Croisilles and Chérisy were visible. The fighting at Rouen remained unresolved. Casualties mounted at an horrifying rate. While in the first 3 days of the offensive, the British lost about 13,000 men, which was considered relatively acceptable by Western Front standards, by the end of April, the count was already in the tens of thousands. The German Sixth Army was also bleeding profusely. According to various estimates, the Germans lost about 125,000 men killed, wounded, and captured. The British First and Third Armies by mid-May accounted for about 160,000 casualties. These were not just numbers in staff reports, these were sons, fathers, brothers, husbands. These were entire villages decimated by conscription. These were generations that would never return. Not only infantrymen perished in this hell. The Royal Flying Corps suffered monstrous losses in the skies over Arras. April 1917 went down in history as Bloody April. The average life expectancy of a British pilot over Arras was 18 hours of flight time. From April 4th to 8th, the Royal Flying Corps lost 75 aircraft and 105 airmen. The reason was the appearance on this sector of the front of Manfred von Richthofen's 11th Fighter Squadron, the legendary Red Baron. German fighters dominated the air, and British reconnaissance and artillery spotters went on missions knowing that the chances of returning were slim. The shortage of pilots became so acute that instructors were recalled from flying schools to the front, and novices were thrown into battle immediately after completing their training. During the same period, 56 aircraft were crashed by inexperienced pilots during landing. The German side also learned lessons. The experience of the Scarpe confirmed the correctness of the new defensive doctrine, but also revealed its weaknesses. The main problem was that reserve divisions did not always manage to reach the battlefield in time. If the enemy attack developed quickly, as it happened on April 9th, the advanced units found themselves left to their own devices. Colonel von Lossberg insisted that counterattacks should be immediate and carried out by the forces of those units directly in the combat zone, rather than waiting for fresh divisions to arrive from the rear. This required granting greater initiative to battalion and company commanders, which went against the Prussian military tradition of centralized command. But Lossberg insisted on his way, and his methods were included in the new edition of the infantry regulations. In parallel, a drama unfolded that newspapers did not write about and headquarters did not speak of: the tragedy of the civilian population. The Scarpa region was densely populated, with dozens of villages and small towns where peasants, artisans, and workers lived. When the war began, many did not have time to evacuate or did not want to abandon their homes and farms. Now they found themselves in the epicenter of the battle. Artillery shelling did not distinguish between military and civilian targets. Shells fell on houses, churches, schools. Villages turned into ruins. Fields were riddled with craters and sown with unexploded shells. Thousands of people fled west, abandoning everything. They walked along the roads in rain and snow, pushing old people and children on carts, carrying bundles with their last possessions. Many died under shelling, others from hunger and disease. Those who remained hid in cellars, in old quarries, in ruins. They ate what they could find, drank water from craters, and suffered from typhus and dysentery. French authorities tried to organize aid for refugees, but the scale of the disaster exceeded all capabilities. Polish and Russian refugees who found themselves in France due to various wartime circumstances also fell into this meat grinder. Some of them worked on farms and factories in the Arras area. Others served in the rear units of the French army. When the battle began, they could not evacuate. They had no documents, no money, no language. Polish testimonies from that time are full of stories of families separated in the chaos of retreat, of children lost on the roads, of women giving birth in cellars under the roar of cannon fire. Russian emigrants and workers also faced hostility from the local population, which, in wartime, regarded all foreigners with suspicion. City dwellers suffered no less than rural residents. Arras, an ancient city with a rich history, was turned into ruins. German artillery systematically destroyed it, block by block. But life seethed underground. In the old medieval cellars and quarries beneath the city, British sappers organized an entire underground city where headquarters, hospitals, and warehouses were located, and where up to 24,500 soldiers could take shelter. Local residents also descended into these catacombs, and there, in the darkness, by the light of electric lamps, two realities, military and civilian, coexisted, not mingling, but also unable to separate. The economic consequences of the battles were catastrophic. Agriculture in the Scarpe region completely ceased. Fields were unfit for cultivation. Livestock was requisitioned or killed. Crops perished. This meant starvation not only for the local population but also for the cities supplied from this area. Industrial enterprises, including the chemical plant near Roux, were destroyed. Workers were left without jobs and without means of subsistence. The French government tried to organize a system of compensation, but the bureaucratic machine worked slowly, and corruption flourished. By the end of April, it became clear that the offensive had run out of steam. The third battle on the Scarpe, which began on May 3rd, was the last attempt to break through the German defenses. The 4th Division attacked east of Monchy, trying to breach the German line and reach Wotanstellung, a new defensive position in depth. The attack was supposed to be coordinated with the Australian offensive at Bullecourt to create a double pressure on the enemy. But neither attack was successful. The British advanced several hundred meters and lost thousands of men. The next day, the offensive was halted. On May 16th, the battle on the Scarpe officially ended. What was achieved? From a military point of view, the results looked ambiguous. The British advanced up to 5.5 kilometers deep in some sectors, captured the dominant Vimy Ridge, took several villages and fortified positions. This was the deepest breakthrough since the beginning of trench warfare, surpassing everything achieved on the Somme. But a strategic breakthrough did not happen. The German defenses held, the front line remained continuous, the war continued. Tactical lessons were learned by both sides. The British proved that they were capable of conducting successful offensive operations against fortified positions, using new methods of artillery preparation, infantry tactics, and coordination of branches of service. The experience of Arras formed the basis for preparations for the Battle of Cambrai and subsequent offensives of 1918. The Germans became convinced of the correctness of the doctrine of deep echeloned defense and further improved it. The war turned into a competition of systems: who learns faster, who adapts more effectively, who uses resources better. But behind these staff calculations and tactical innovations lay a human cost that cannot be expressed in numbers. Almost 300,000 people killed, wounded, and missing on both sides in 5 weeks. Thousands crippled for life. Tens of thousands of civilians who lost homes, loved ones, and their future. An entire region turned into a moonscape, where years after the war, remains and unexploded ordnance would still be found. The history of the battles on the Scarpe became a story not about victory or defeat, but about the nature of modern warfare. It showed that technology had changed the character of conflict beyond recognition. Artillery could unleash millions of kilograms of explosives on a square kilometer, wipe entire cities off the face of the earth, but could not guarantee victory. Aviation provided unprecedented intelligence information, but paid for it with the lives of pilots. Tanks promised a breakthrough, but got stuck in the mud and burned from armor-piercing bullets. Engineering reached new heights, building underground cities and quickly erected bridges. But every bridge became a trap. The war on the Scarpe revealed another truth. In modern conflict, there is no rear. The civilian population suffers no less and sometimes more than soldiers. Artillery shelling, evacuations, hunger, disease, economic destruction, all these are parts of a single picture. The distinction between front and rear was blurred, and the war turned into a total conflict involving all layers of society. French and British staffs continued to analyze the experience of the Scarpe long after the battle ended. Particular attention was paid to the problem of crossings. It was recognized that old methods of pontoon construction were outdated. Faster, more protected, more flexible solutions were needed. The development of metal prefabricated bridges began, which could be erected in a matter of hours. Tactics of smokescreens were developed to cover construction. The possibility of underwater crossings for tanks was studied. All this experience proved useful in World War II, when forcing water obstacles became one of the key operations. The German command also did not stand aside. The experience of repelling the British offensive on the Scarpe became the basis for further improvement of defensive tactics. The role of assault battalions, elite units specially trained for counterattacks, was strengthened. The autonomy of lower-level commanders was increased. The communication system between forward units and artillery was improved. By the end of the war, the German army possessed perhaps the most effective defensive system in the world. But this could no longer change the outcome of the conflict. For Poland and Russia, which were at that moment in a state of internal crisis, the events on the Western Front had special significance. Polish legionnaires served both on the side of the Entente and on the side of the Central Powers, and the fate of each of these people was tied to the outcome of the war. News of the bloody carnage on the Scarpe reached Warsaw and Krakow, where families waited for letters from the front. Many of these letters never came. For Russia, 1917 became the year of revolution, and the fate of Russian soldiers and refugees in France turned out to be tragic. Many of them never returned home, settling in France, Belgium, and other European countries. The memory of the war became part of their identity, a wound that did not heal. Today, more than 100 years after these events, the fields of the Scarpe are green, villages are rebuilt, rivers flow peacefully. But dig a little deeper, and the earth reveals its secrets. Remains of soldiers, unexploded shells, fragments of weapons are still found. In Commonwealth cemeteries, white headstones stand in rows, each with a name, regiment, date. Many bear the inscription, "Known unto God," because they could not be identified. This is not just a memory of war, it is a reminder of what happens when humanity resolves its disputes by force. The lessons of the Scarpe are relevant today. They say that military power has limits. That technology does not replace strategy. That no amount of training guarantees an easy victory. That war always costs more than it seems at the beginning. That civilians pay for the conflicts of politicians and generals. And that the memory of the fallen is not just a ritual, but a moral obligation of the living to those who gave their lives in battles whose meaning they often did not understand. The battles on the Scarpe did not decide the outcome of the First World War. They were one of many episodes in a 4-year meat grinder that ground millions of lives and changed the world forever. But it was precisely such episodes, precisely such battles, that showed the true face of 20th century warfare. Not romance and not heroism, but industrial extermination, where man becomes expendable, and victory is measured not by conquered cities, but by the number of losses you can afford. And in this sense, the Scarpe became a symbol of the senselessness of positional warfare. A symbol of the courage of soldiers thrown into an attack against machine guns. A symbol of the suffering of civilians caught between a hammer and an anvil. A symbol of the stubbornness of generals who continued offensives even when it became clear that there would be no breakthrough. And a symbol that war had changed forever, turning from a clash of armies into a clash of nations, where victory is achieved not by those who fight better, but by those who can endure losses longer. When the guns fell silent on the Scarpe on May 16, 1917, no one celebrated victory. The surviving soldiers, exhausted, dirty, with wild eyes, trudged to the rear for rest. Medics still collected the wounded from the battlefield for weeks. Civilians returned to what was left of their homes, and in the headquarters, the next offensive was already being planned. Because this was a war that devoured everyone indiscriminately, victors and vanquished, military and civilian, hopes and illusions. And the only lesson humanity could have learned from the Scarpe was a simple truth. This must never happen again. But history has shown that this lesson was not learned.